Hello, India Cloud Security Summit. My name is Tatu Seppälä, and I will be talking to you for the next 45 minutes or so about my experiences rolling out information protection data loss prevention in real-life organizations over the last few years and what I've learned. Some of the things that I've learned. A bit about me. I currently work as a security and compliance architect at a company called Sulava in Finland. We work on everything Microsoft 365. I'm also MCT currently. I work on a lot of topics, but my main thing above all else is data security, insider risk, and compliance. That's what I spend most of my time on. When I'm not working, I'm doing anything other than IT, like taking pictures, working out, getting out of the door. So I'm not on the computer all around the clock, but I am on the computer a lot, and it's more than just work for me actually. So to kind of ground this discussion, I'd like to bring up something Gartner said back in earlier this year. Actually, they came out with this interesting report and raised the prediction that by 2025, lack of talent or human failure will be responsible for over half of significant cyber incidents. The human element must not be underestimated here. People are as important as technology, and they will be more so when we go forward. And to help keep people kind of in the loop over the next few years, we need to take data security seriously, and it's not just about technology. And today we're going to be talking about two elements here, two different elements that kind of come together as a whole. Just to base the discussion, we need to understand the two concepts on a high level, what they're about. So we're talking about two concepts here when we're talking about data security. We're talking about sensitivity labels, first of all, which are an indicator of the risk level, ultimately, of a piece of information. That's what they really are. They're an indicator of the risk level. They provide things like encryption, visual markings, auditing, and they integrate with data loss prevention, which is the other side of the coin. And data loss prevention, on the other hand, gives us indicators about the movements and actions taken up with sensitive data. They are a tool, above all, in my opinion, of providing guidance and awareness to people. Now, they can be seen as a cybersecurity tool, but I believe that's not really their core value. So we're going to be talking about sensitivity labels. We're going to be talking about data loss prevention today. And those two come together to provide something called data protection or data security. So that's what we're going to be talking about here today. In my real life rollouts, and I've done a lot now, like going from zero to something else, I've kind of noticed that there are 5 different stages to rollouts, really, when they're done properly. There's 5 different stages, and today we're going to break down those stages and what I've learned. So this is not a perfect guide to rolling out data security to an organization, but these are things that are not obvious. The 5 stages are preparation, design of the solution, discovering information, building some awareness, and then finally protecting and preventing misuse of data. To get started, before you even roll out anything, before you even dream of rolling out anything, you need to prepare a little bit to be successful. What I've learned about preparation is that you need to do a bit of groundwork and answer a few questions, even before you do any technical work. So for each organization, you need to first understand what the risk is if we don't do anything over the next few years. So there's not just the risk in rolling something out of, messing up production, but there's a risk in not doing anything, the risk to our data, for example. What do we actually want to accomplish? The actual goal is not to roll out technology, it's to accomplish a business goal. Let's say building up resilience. And who do we actually need? And this is the most crucial part that often gets done wrong, I think. It's not involving the right people even before we start. But first, we need to understand why data security is important. Of course, there might be variation from organization to organization, but there are certain trends that the team working on this needs to really grasp what's happening in the world and with the customer you're working with. So the first thing is, Ragnar actually touched on this a little bit. There's more data being created every day, but it's not really disappearing at the other end, right? There's more and more stuff. It's not disappearing. And with more information, there's more risk. So the volume of data is growing, but it's not really being taken care of more every day. There's just more exposure. Data is moving around a lot more. We're working on all kinds of devices in all kinds of places. Bringing your own devices is a lot more normal now than it used to be. There's no more office network for many companies. The people are de facto working from anywhere. So data is moving around a lot more. Then in many parts of the world, the regulatory environment is evolving as well. There's a lot more demands placed on organizations to remain compliant, even before going into business requirements. So we need to be able to take care of those going forward. And people, let's not forget about people. Just because technology is evolving doesn't mean people interacting with the technology are evolving with the technology. So we need to kind of do something to keep people, on board going forward, to enable people to take care of our data. So I've noticed a couple of types of risks. There are both kind of internal risks for organizations and external ones, and we need to kind of understand these before we start. There are internal risks, as we mentioned, data estate is expanding. This is kind of our own data estate expanding. Are people not necessarily that aware of what the sensitive data looks like? There might not be any enforced guidelines, which is different than having guidelines. Just having guidelines doesn't mean anything if you don't enforce them. And insider threats are, on the rise with more access to sensitive data for many and more freedom. But there are also external risks which are not in our control, which is, regulation and the possibility of reputational damage. All right. So this is why we want to work on data security, why we want to use technology. But if we want to get something done, we need to understand what we want to do. So a typical situation that I see in the field is that we have a tenant, Microsoft 365 tenant, which has, let's say, a couple of thousand gigabytes of whatever in SharePoint Online, OneDrive, elsewhere. Even the company might not know themselves what they have. They just have a lot of something. You might know the situation. No idea what there actually is. And even within the company, there might not be a shared idea of what the data looks like. So what the sensitive data looks like. What is most important. So, and even if you know what's most important, it's very common to not know what people are actually doing, if they're copying stuff to USB drives, if they're sharing things in an insecure way, all of this. And training might just be a box you check when people start working, provide one-time training, and then just say, do the needful, So this is very common, unfortunately. A goal for a data security project is not then both technical and non-technical. What you want to actually aim for is to understand your data estate, understand what you have and where it is and how much of it you have. You want to understand and automatically discover your key business data, not all data, but just, the top 5% most critical data. You want to automatically be able to identify that and protect it. You want the an audit trail, so you can show what actually happened even later on when data was moved around, who moved it, what happened. And you want to enforce the awareness of people in everyday work. You want to keep people, keep people sharp when they're handling sensitive data And as actually, I think Ragnar might have mentioned something about this as well. We need to, at some point, get rid of data at the end of its life cycle, so more data doesn't crop up. So this is what we're trying to do, but we need people to do it. And this is something, the first point that really isn't obvious, but data security, even though there's the word data in it, it's not really an IT thing. I'm sorry, but IT is not the business function that really should be driving this. The needs are actually, the problems we're trying to solve are not IT problems. In most of my mature customer organizations, data security functions are largely owned by functions like legal and compliance. IT enables, but we need a lot of other functions to successfully pull this off. We need support from C-levels. We need the data protection office to raise privacy concerns, for example. We need HR, because whatever we do needs to resonate across the recruitment, joiners, leavers lifecycle. So you need to connect with other functions in the organization than just IT. And that means bringing them together. And this is the first best practice. So identify as many of these other functions as you can, get a couple of trusted people from there, bring them into the same working group from the start. So don't just make IT roll everything out. That has never led to a successful outcome in my experience. You need some other functions as well. Functions like HR and comms and others. Make a single team, bring in a couple of people, and discuss what you're going to do before you do it. Now we're kind of prepared when we have the right people and we know what we're trying to actually do. Then we get to the design phase. And here, there are a couple of mistakes here that are easy to make in the design phase that I've learned to avoid. Maybe there are others, please share if there are. But let's go through a couple of things. So when we're talking about sensitivity labels, you have a couple of different levels of labels that you can use. You have the basic labeling taxonomy. For every organization, it looks a little bit different, but it might look something like this. You might have four different levels or 5, hopefully no more than 5, by the way, from public to secret. The first level, the parent label, you should use it, in my experience, to indicate the risk level. So the first parent labels indicate risk level. How risky is this data? You can then build sub-labels under the parent labels, which indicate granular permissions. Using these parent labels and sub-labels in this way is kind of logical and has usually worked out rather well. Also, one little note here. You can use encryption with sensitivity labels, but a little tip, even for general labels that use encryption, you should provide an unencrypted alternative, since not all external systems really work well with Microsoft's encryption. So a little tip there, you're going to want to provide an unprotected alternative for any sensitivity labels deployed to the whole organization. For special cases, it's different, but for general labels, that's definitely a tip right there. And also consider who actually needs each sensitivity label, even the parent labels. If you have something like secret, does the entire organization actually even produce that doing their work? If they don't actually produce secret material, why give them the label? So we can kind of use the KISS principle. Keep it simple, stupid. Don't give more labels to people than they actually need. All right. When you have the labels, we have people from many different cultures. Not everything needs to be in English or Indian or Finnish only. So you can use PowerShell, security and compliance PowerShell, do a little bit of legwork and translate each label to many different languages according to Office language settings. Takes a little bit more work. It's very recommended to do so. Also, you can even translate the tooltips, and I really recommend doing this as well. Getting to read the labels in your own native language really helps. helps understand their purpose. Yeah, it's a bit of a technical thing. So if you're not a technical person yourself, get someone technical to do it and figure out the translations. So best practice number 1 here, from my experience, the best way to go about using sensitivity labels and DLP is to design them together. To not just design sensitivity labels and then look at DLP later on, but to design them together, since they kind of provide two sides of the coin, right? Sensitivity labels provide encryption and markings for data itself, and data loss prevention rules provide more control and information about how that data is moved around, when it's copied to USB, the ability to block that, the ability to require justification when sensitivity labeled data is, for example, uploaded to cloud services. So design those two together. And what that might look like, this is going to be ugly because it's a real life Excel from a real kind of customer project. You might even want to just map out the whole thing in Excel. Lay out your labels, lay out your DLP controls and encryption controls all in one go, so you see the whole picture before you implement anything. You want to implement those two together to reinforce each other. Talking about encryption, here's the second point that is easy to mess up. Using encryption with sensitivity labels like confidential and secret is very it's a good idea, but it must be done mindfully. It's really easy to mess up encryption by going too restrictive. A lot of customers get really excited about encryption and want to encrypt everything and encrypt very restrictive permissions. But my recommendation from real life is to never go initially never go anywhere more restrictive than co-owner for any label that's used by the whole organization, because if you look at what actually this what you can actually do with even co-author, which is the second most restrictive encryption template, you have things like nobody else but the person applying the label can change the label anymore, which will break a lot of business processes that you don't know about. So my recommendation is to start with co-owner always, if you don't specifically know about all the business processes where labels might need to be changed by different people across the document lifecycle. And for Copilot organizations, anything above co-author, I mean less permissive than co-author, will not actually show up. If a person doesn't have co-author or above, the document's contents will not show up in Copilot interactions anymore because of certain missing encryption permissions, copy extract, and well, mostly copy extract actually. So there are these little details that really matter for encryption. And when you're designing permissions for encryption, you're going to want to remember that you can give other domains than your own tenant or its domain permissions. So you can give your partners permissions as well. If you have large partner organizations that you collaborate with a lot, you can actually factor that in. Okay. So the next best practice in the design phase is probably the most important one that I see messed up the most in the technical side. Default labels. Default labels are a very popular choice to use when rolling out sensitivity labels. They're very easy to set up and get everything to have some kind of label, but that's really not what you want, is it? If you give default labels immediately, what it can actually lead to, and it usually does, is that because people aren't used to sensitivity labeling stuff, they just don't ever need to think about it. So everything within a year, every single document almost in the entire organization will end up with the default label, no matter what their actual contents are, which actually leads to massive underclassification and takes out almost all of the value of sensitivity labeling altogether. It's now actually worse than it was before there were any labels, because now you can't make the choice easily again. So my advice would be to never use default labels when rolling out sensitivity labels in real life. Never. That's like the last step you can actually use after automation and everything else. Forget default labeling, service level. So what do you actually want to do then? You want to start with manual labeling and mandatory labeling and have training and guidance in place to give people tips on how to use labels, proper tool tips. You might want to, if you are in E5 or E5 compliance, you might want to look at recommended labels which still make the user actually interact with sensitivity labels, but give them a little bit of guidance. And you want to have a champions network and leadership actually talk about sensitivity labels and promote how to use them correctly. But stay away from default labels if you want to be successful. Then talking about DLP policies, you're going to want to, in my experience, Microsoft says something else in their presentations, but in my experience, you're going to want to create a dedicated DLP policy, data loss prevention policy for each workload. So one for Exchange Online, one for SharePoint Online, and so forth. This is because by creating a dedicated DLP policy for each workload, you get differentiated policy tips. You can have a different policy tips for policy tip text for OneDrive compared to SharePoint, for example. You get workload-specific rule conditions, like for example, in Exchange Online, you only get certain conditions if you only have a DLP policy for Exchange Online that you're going to be missing otherwise. You get more granular auditing, and you get even differentiated controls. So to future-proof your DLP implementation, in my opinion and experience, you're going to want to split the DLP policies per workload always. And you're probably going to want to, even at least for medium to large organizations and above, you're going to want to use some kind of ring model for deploying DLP. This is a recent insight. Last year I didn't have this experience yet, but now I do. So you're going to want to set up maybe 2, maybe 3, maybe even 4 rings where you kind of keep pushing DLP controls slowly to test that they would do what you think you want to do. So the first ring for technical validation is about 20 people, maybe a small ring, just to make sure everything works technically roughly how you want it to. That's where you start with all new controls except auditing. Ring 2 might be 5% of the organization. Ring 3 is slightly larger, and then you have baseline, which is production basically. So you roll controls out ring by ring slowly. This is basic change management, but you need to apply it to DLP as well to really be successful and not mess up production. And you should actually build this into your DLP rules, in my experience. You're going to want to have a clear naming convention for your DLP rules and your DLP policies. These are DLP policies. I use the convention of 3 or 4 numbers before the actual workload. So there's an index number. I even built in the ring into the index number. So the first number is the workload. Number 1 is Exchange. The second number is the deployment ring, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. And the third number is just it's always 0 for the actual policy. And it's even reflected in the DLP rules. Same kind of naming convention where you have in red the rule number within the policy, workload, the actual conditions expressed in however way you want to, and then the controls. The benefit from having some kind of consistent naming convention actually comes up when you go into tools like Activity Explorer and filter by rule. You don't need to do complex filtering to figure out certain kinds of matches. If you have a proper DLP rule naming convention, you can just look at the rule names in Activity Explorer and other tools, and you instantly know what the rule is about. For example, this one, Exchange Online, looking for credentials that are shared externally, and the rule only audits these events. Then we get to the next stage, which is discovery. Discovery is the first and most important phase that you cannot skip of any actual rollout. So you need to understand what you know, what you have, before you can protect it. Visibility is the absolute key. So what we need to see here, we need to see sensitive data both in the cloud and in on-premises. If you have a strong presence in on-premises, we want to see sensitivity labeling events. We want to see DLP rule matches. You want to see justifications people give or when they override our restrictions, and we want to understand how sensitive data moves around and what's being done with it. And we have a couple of different ways to build that visibility. We have certain tools for understanding where data is located, static data, what we have and where does it reside. And for the movements of data, we have different tools. So you need to understand that there are two different kinds of visibility you can build. And once you build that visibility, you then take that information and base your solution design on that understanding of how the organization works. I'd go deeper into this, but for interests of time, we're going to keep it at a high level. Just make sure you understand the various tools you can use to build visibility into data locations and how it's being used before you design your solution, technically. Talking about building visibility, you have a little bit of a pipeline actually going that you should know about that I've used. I tend to use this in every project now. You can start in Activity Explorer. It's easy. It's in the compliance portal. It's fast to get going with, but it only goes 1 month back. So that's a bit of a drawback if you try to track longer rollouts and trends. And you can't easily combine that data with in large scale with other data. But you can ingest data from the unified audit log shown in the Activity Explorer into Sentinel and Log Analytics. And this is where it gets kind of powerful, because you can do then long-term trend analysis on data security events. And you can even then export that into Azure Data Explorer. It has a new name now that I don't remember, for up to 100 years of retention. That should be enough for any organization. But the thing here is that using Sentinel and Log Analytics, actually it's kind of tech heavy. You have a learning cliff there. You need to understand KQL. You're not going to have your leadership looking at Log Analytics. So when you need to communicate things in Log Analytics, you then take, for example, Power BI, which is what I do, which makes data and insights visual. It's the best tool for explaining and telling stories about data to others that are not technical in your working group and in leadership. And the best part here for many countries is that you can exclude personally identifying information from datasets in Log Analytics, and you don't need to bring that into your analytics, the usernames and things like that. And you can even bring those reports into Teams Mobile. Of course, it takes effort to build reports, but it's not that hard. I'm not a Power BI guru, but I built something like this in like a short evening or two for a recent customer project. Just communicate certain things to a customer. And when you can show analytics like this about what you're actually doing to leadership and your project team, you get a lot more backing for your ongoing efforts, and you can tell stories. All right, so best practice number 6 is to ensure visibility and train at least the key people, even the non-technical ones in your project team, to use the Activity Explorer to track things. It's easy to get around. It's not very technical. And if you need to bring stuff into Sentinel, you should know about 3 connectors in Sentinel that bring events into Log Analytics. You have the Microsoft Purview Information Protection connector. You have the Microsoft 365 Defender connector, and you can even bring in Office activities through the M365 connector. The most important one of these, I think, is the DLP rule matches and endpoint events through the Microsoft 365 Defender connector. That's the most critical information usually for rollouts. Labeling events are nice as well. You can also use document fingerprints, a pretty recommendable place to start building custom classifiers. If you don't know what those are, we can go into that outside of the session if you want to, but you can ask your HR for work contract templates. Almost every company has them. Your operations might have project budget planning spreadsheets and stuff like this. So it only takes like 5 minutes to an easy user interface in the compliance portal to make a sensitive information type from these document templates. Then you can use them to these sensitive information types to detect these documents even in a filled form with information across your services and in data loss prevention rules. So get to know document fingerprints is my recommendation for the discovery phase, and use them. It's a very easy starting point. And you're going to want to look at extending Sentinel data retention. You're going to want to configure these certain tables, not everything, but the tables that have your relevant data. If you pull data into Sentinel, into log analytics, to be retained for longer than 3 months, maybe 1 year, then you can analyze trends properly. It's not a large volume data source, so it shouldn't cost too much. And privacy. Privacy is very important. When you pull stuff in from log analytics to your Power BI and others, you're going to want to exclude things like user principal names and display names until from the data. Just leave user GUIDs there, because you don't really need to pull in identifying information, so you might as well leave that out and focus on larger trends. We're gonna want to help organizations change and not build an adversarial mindset where we focus on individuals and what they're doing in these projects. Building awareness. We're a bit short on time, but I'm gonna try to keep it concise here. We generally, all of us here in this call and elsewhere, we want to do the right thing as long as we know what it is. The problem here is that when people come into organizations like your customers and your own organization, people are given initial training, okay, but how long does it take until that initial training is forgotten? Might be weeks, might be months, but eventually people are not going to remember what they were told initially. So the problem here is information retention. By giving policy tip reminders through DLP, this is probably DLP's most important function, by the way, in real life, in my experience, we can keep that awareness kind of constant. Since every day people get exposed to tips all across the services they work with, reminding them of sensitive data and what should be done, the awareness is kept sharp over time. So this is like consistent policy tips that give the same message, actionable message across services are absolutely essential. And you're going to want to deploying them very early. This is probably your biggest value add that you can get to fast in your rollout. But policy tips can be made very inaccessible. Do not have IT design policy tips. We at IT, we have a lot of jargon that regular people don't actually understand. Even the word encryption itself is too much. So work with comms people to design those policy tips and make them accessible. And explicitly, you need to tell in policy tips people what is expected of them and document those texts as well so you can keep track of them. What I mean by explicitly telling people what is expected of them, you can have two types of policy tips. A lot of organizations like to tell people to handle information according to company policy, but you should actually always assume that people don't remember what the company policy is to begin with. That's why we have policy tips. So tell people what they need to do, whether it's sending over a secure email or doing something else. Just tell people what they actually need to do instead of referring to company policy. These policy tips can also be localized by PowerShell, by the way, and I recommend doing it. If you're localizing sensitivity labels, I also recommend localizing policy tips for a consistent experience. And a short hint as well, you're going to want to build some sort of information resource that easily explains these controls, and you're going to want to guide and direct people to this resource, data security resource, in various places. You have a lot of places where you can give links to people to follow to this place, this resource. We're not going to go over them for interest of time in more detail, but build some sort of resource that you direct people to over time. Then we get to the final stage, which is protecting and preventing information loss. When something is actually explicitly disallowed by your company, it should also be not possible to do by mistake. So we're going to want to help people not make mistakes. When you're preparing to use encryption, which is one of the key controls here, you're going to want to understand how to decrypt as an admin. People are going to make mistakes, and situations are going to arise where you need to remove that encryption. You have two options for that, with SharePoint Online PowerShell and with the local commands. You're going to want to get familiar with both of them. I personally really like unlocks SPO sensitivity label encrypted files, since you can use that without having direct access to the file on your local computer as an admin. But get familiar with these. And also make sure you turn on co-authoring for files with sensitivity labels. This is a setting that is easy to overlook, but it's absolutely critical for many reasons. For example, if you don't have this on, people will not be able to collaborate on encrypted files at the same time. So they're not going to be happy. How to choose your DLP controls? I like to approach it through a little bit of a questionnaire. So first I think about, can we actually detect the risky scenario in a reliable way? If we cannot, then we're only going to audit, since we're not going to want to, the goal is to not break business processes. And if we can, are we actually confident that the scenario isn't really part of any established business process, even if we can reliably detect it? And if we are not confident that there's a business process involved or not, we can only want to block with override to analyze people's justifications. And only if we know that there's no business process involved, then we can directly block stuff. So don't be too hasty to block everything. You can mess up a lot of real life stuff there. Really short on time here, but luckily we're almost done. Another thing, final thing, you're going to want to configure some endpoint DLP settings. So a couple of these, even before your real rollout, you're going to want to turn on. One thing, advanced classification, scanning, and protection for endpoint DLP. This is in endpoint DLP settings. Once you turn this on, you're going to be able to actually use things like document fingerprints and other technical controls on endpoints. And you're going to want to work with the network team to determine some bandwidth limits, since this feature needs to send data over the internet to be classified online. So it takes up internet bandwidth. You can set limits on that. So take a look at it. Also, you want to define which browsers are actually official browsers for your organization. Is it Edge? Is it Chrome? Is it maybe Firefox? Understand those and configure Purview endpoint DLP so that all other browsers are unallowed, meaning that they cannot no longer interact with sensitive data. You can only use the allowed browsers with sensitive data. You're going to want to use something called service domain groups. You're going to want to figure out which domains are approved for your company, first of all, with your SharePoint and your other services, and define those as groups. You can use these in endpoint DLP policies later on. I can link a blog about that in the chat later that explains this in more detail. And you're going to want to turn on both a couple of low-hanging fruits there. Coverage of network shares. It's an admin setting that expands coverage for endpoint DLP. No real downsides, and just-in-time protection in audit mode. Just a couple of, I won't explain them in more detail due to time, but make sure you look at those endpoint DLP settings. Just wrapping up, one more thing. Let's recap a little bit. There are 5 keys to a successful rollout in my experience. You're going to want to make this a team sport. You're going to want to inform your design efforts through auditing. So collect data first, analyze it, and then design. Clarity in messaging is critical. It's easy to dip into tech jargon and be unclear. People need to understand why you're doing something and not just what you're doing. And communication builds trust. Once you tell people why you're doing things, they trust your goals and not just, do what they're told. And your main goal always in these rollouts is to not mess up business processes, at least not without backing from, leadership. If leadership says it's fine to mess up business processes, then okay. But otherwise, you're going to want to be consistent. You're going to want to be patient and not rush too much. But yeah, remember, this is just beginning. Sensitivity labels and DLP, they're the start. The story leads to capabilities like insider risks, communication compliance, and lots of other capabilities afterwards. So plan ahead a little bit and understand what everything builds towards. It's not the end once you deploy these two. So the 5 phases we covered very rapidly here. Hope it wasn't too much. I think I'm going a bit over time almost. So if you want to connect with me, follow. I write a lot about these topics in more detail in my blog. So scan the QR code and connect with me on LinkedIn. If anyone has any questions, drop them in the chat so we can let the next speaker get going. But to the sponsors, thank you one more time. It was a pleasure being here. And Aniket, I think we're going to let the next speaker get going at this point.
Thank you so much, Tatu, for this amazing session. If we have any questions for Tatu, then we can move forward with that.
And I'm just going to hang around a little bit in chat if anyone